All right, we are live from Occupy City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. This is our Antar and Leslie's Thursday discussion. We missed last week. It was because of the weather. It was raining pretty bad last week, so excuse me. We back again this week to try to make up for that. My name is Leslie Roth. I'm a member of the May 30th Alliance. One of the things we have been doing previously, and one of the things I have been doing previously, is at the beginning of all of these videos, doing a introduction in which I explained, what we were doing outside of the city hall in Rockford, Illinois, and how long we have been outside the city hall in Rockford, Illinois. I'm trying to get into a place of, instead of using that introduction at the beginning of all the lives that we do, instead doing that introduction and entitling it the Rockford Rundown, and doing that and releasing that once a day, so that way even if we don't do a live, it's being reiterated, and also so that way as we continue to get longer and longer into this occupation and more events happen, so that way this introduction doesn't become too much extended, and that way we can sort of try to dive into what the topics on hand are. So for anybody who is watching and wants more information or more understanding as to why we're outside the city hall in Rockford, Illinois, we have the Rockford Rundown from this morning pinned to the top of the May 30th Alliance Facebook page. So my name is Leslie Roth. As I said, I'm a member of the May 30th Alliance. The May 30th Alliance is a direct action organization located in Rockford, Illinois, dedicated to the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. I'm here today with Antar, and I'll let Antar give his own introduction.
Antar Baker, also a member of the May 30th Alliance.
Okay, and so today our main topic at hand is going to be police terrorism. We have a few pieces printed out that we're going to read through, and then provide context and some thoughts, some secondary thoughts to the information that we have printed out here to read. So I think you said we wanted to go with this one first. Yeah. This one first. All right. So we'll have Antar will lead off on it, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. As a bit of a preface to that, I wanted to say that I heard Leslie talking downtown before about the fact that the three priorities, the three goals of the May 30th Alliance, they are aligned or arranged in a certain order for a very specific and contextual purpose. And I have to be, I think that when we talk about police terrorism, and the reason why we call it police terrorism instead of simply police brutality, or as some people label what happened to George Floyd a social justice issue, but by using police terrorism, we're talking about something a little more drastic and a little more something that needs to be researched or studied a little bit more or a little deeper into, and that is how much of a problem police terrorism is, and the minority communities in particular, and marginalized communities. I thought that I knew to a certain degree the level of seriousness of police terrorism or police brutality. But as I looked into it a little more, I found out that it's even more serious, and it has even more effects on the basic people activities of marginalized communities, African American males in particular. And I wanted you, Leslie, to just talk a little bit more about why you put police terrorism as the first goal or objective for the May 30th Alliance.
I think that for us, we wanted to. What is this dude doing? Look at this. All right, sorry about that. We got a dude across the street. I don't know what he doing. But anyways, for us, I think the main reason that we have police terrorism at the forefront of the things that we're struggling against is because of the clear and present and the direct danger that the police enforcement and law enforcement presents to specifically to marginalized and exploited and oppressed groups in the country and in the society, but also to everybody as a whole and everybody on a larger scale. And with the understanding that once you understand police terrorism, part of understanding it gets you into the beginning of understanding mass incarceration. Part of understanding police terrorism gets you into the beginnings of understanding racial injustice. And once you can, and police terrorism, again, is something that is white people have to deal with police terrorism. Black people deal with police terrorism. Men, women, people, no matter what your sexual preferences or even class status. I think that that's one of the things that is more difficult once you get into some of these other aspects, is that when you get into the process of mass incarceration, there is a sort of, it begins to be a bigger separation between the type of people who deal with mass incarceration and the type of people who deal with police terrorism. Police terrorism can be something as simple as a person driving, just got a brand new car, and a police officer pulls them over because they never seen that car in the neighborhood before. And then the things that go into that stop, the intimidation that goes into the stop, if a person doesn't know their rights, the manipulation that goes into that stop, all of those things are forms of police terrorism, are microaggressions of police terrorism. And we see these things happen on a regular basis every day throughout every city in the country. And so I think because of the regularity of police terrorism, the amount of people that it encompasses, is something that if you do the job of trying to explain that to people and articulate that to people, it gets them in a place where they are mentally prepared to hear about mass incarceration. And once you have used police terrorism and mass incarceration, again, in my opinion, is sort of building blocks for these conversations, you get to a place where it's much easier to have the conversation about racial injustice, because part of understanding police terrorism lets you know that black people and brown people disproportionately deal with it. Part of understanding mass incarceration lets you know that black people and brown people disproportionately deal with it, and that gets you into the very beginnings of understanding racial injustice. And so for me and for us, those are some of the reasons that police terrorism is at the forefront. And then also one of the things that has been a uniting factor for people in the society and in the community and in the country has been macro aggressions of police terrorism have been used as have been ways to begin these conversations. Whether it be George Floyd being lynched in the streets and the sheer brutality of it, offending people to the point in which some people who may not have been prepared to ever have a conversation about mass incarceration or ever have a conversation about racial injustice, because of the sheer brutality of an act of police terrorism, they become more apt to have a conversation about all of these things. So for us, those are all some of the things that go into the reasons which police terrorism is at the forefront, and why I believe it's important for it to be at the forefront.
And you've answered this question before too, but a lot of people will ask why police terrorism is a priority. Why not education? Why not healthcare? Why not job training? Why not some of these things? Can you answer that?
Yeah.
That sort of.
And I think for us, one of the things that we have learned and realized is that there isn't an aspect of the society that police terrorism has not infiltrated in some manner or another. When you begin to speak about issues that we have in the educational system, just as important as it would be to speak about the issues in the curriculum and the miseducation that children have, we also can't separate the fact that police officers in the majority of public schools in this country patrol the hallways. We can't escape the fact that police officers and police and law enforcement do lockdowns in these schools, and the school to prison pipeline is something that has been documented and has been one of the has been that phrase is put in the lexicon of social injustice struggles that have happened here. And so with the understanding that even within education, police terrorism plays a role in perpetuating the negatives of negatives of miseducation and police terrorism, you get to a place where you understand that part of adequately addressing the issues we have in the educational system will force you to address the issues of police terrorism. The same thing goes with if we're speaking about let's say economics or finances, or people not having equal opportunities in jobs and things of that nature. When you look at the amount of finances that go to police officers, when you look at the amount of finances that go to the institution of policing as a whole, even if you separate it from just the salary that these police officers get, you see that one of the ways that we can counter the lack of employment opportunities in the public sector is by cutting down some of these jobs that are being allocated to law enforcement, allocating them to other areas. And so at every step that you look, because of how ingrained into the society policing has become, you see that it is something that before you can adequately absolve or address any of these other issues, you must build the base that understands what institutions are shielding some of these other things and allowing it and being able to enable some of these other institutions to work in the manner in which they work. If you speak about even electoral politics, maybe people who put electoral politics at the forefront, I think one of the things that's important to remember is that when they pass disenfranchisement laws for voting in these different cities and in these different states, it will be the police officers that enforce those disenfranchisement laws. When we speak about people who have been disenfranchised from voting, from being felons, or because they're in jail or in prison at the time that elections happen, they get into those places because of law enforcement and because of policing. And so there isn't an issue or an institutional problem that we have in this country that we can face without first facing the problems of police terrorism.
And one more point of preface or introduction before we start reading the articles. Like, I want to reiterate some of the stuff you were saying. Like I said, I thought let me look into and study, how police terrorism affects other areas of human activity, and I must say that it's much worse, much more terrible than I thought. And I think that you can research or Google any topic. You can say the effect of police terrorism on black crime, and you'll find research. The effect of police terrorism on mental health. The effects of police terrorism on the economy. You will find that police participated in, riots. Let's say, what is the main one? The Tulsa riots, the Tulsa massacre, really. Black Wall Street, or the destruction of Black Wall Street. You'll find that police blended in and helped the white vigilante citizens fight against the black people that was trying to defend themselves. You even find the police confiscated weapons and helped it. And you'll find that police terrorism or police murder or killings is one of the leading causes of death of African American males. Like, those things I didn't know. I knew that it was terrible, but to the extent of how terrible it is, I think we have to really assess so that we can really realize why it's so important to address it. Because a lot of people have expressed bewilderment on why we talk about police terrorism so much, and we said they prioritize other things above them. And it's even to the point in the research that I did that you can curve street level violence by ending police terrorism. I don't think a lot of people that's a far-fetched thing to people, but there's research to back it up. And so we just have a few stories that we're going to share, but I encourage you, like I said, you can find the connections between police terrorism and just about every social justice problem that we have in America. And like I said, I was totally unaware of that. Some of the things that I found by, doing a little bit of surface research really shocked me. And then it made it even more profound when I thought about that you said police terrorism. And even one of these articles said that police terrorism is like a snapshot of racism in America, And then we also know that people, the reaction that people have when an act of police terrorism is caught on camera or something like that. People seem to have, and people want to know, why is the reaction to police terrorism more extreme than, say, a reaction to redlining or a reaction to discrimination in education or healthcare. But I think that'll become clear. The first article that I'm going to read from is called "Police Violence: Physical and Mental Health Impacts on Black Americans," and this story was on medicalnewstoday.com. Medical News. We can post a link underneath the live. It's called "Police Violence," and I'll get the author's name. It's called "Police Violence: Physical and Mental Health Impacts on Black Americans." In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, we zoom in on police violence as a leading cause of death among young black men in the United States. This special feature looks at some of the ways in which police use of force affects the mental and physical health of black Americans. The authors of a 2018 study, Trusted Source, estimate that police kill more than 300 black Americans, at least a quarter of them unarmed, each year in the USA. Another paper estimates that 1 in 1,000 young black men are likely to be killed by the police in the U.S. over the course of a lifetime. And also, I wanted to say that I think one of the mottos of the Family Peace Center, to make it relevant to Rockford, the Family Peace Center in Rockford, is that street or youth violence is predicated on domestic violence, because young people experience violence when you experience violence as a young age, you're more likely to carry out violence, or you're more likely to commit acts of violence. And the same thing can be said about police violence. If there might be research into the how many children experience the first form of violence that they experience is police violence. And so if the Family Peace Center wants to stop domestic violence, stop inter-community violence like that, police terrorism, police violence is something that has stopping police terrorism, police violence has a positive effect on stopping domestic violence. The killing of George Floyd and the ensuing Black Lives Matter protests have brought police use of force into focus once again, and some people making the point that officials should regard police violence as a threat to public health. The disproportionate rate of police-related deaths among black Americans is a bitter reality with emotional implications that a medical news article cannot truthfully capture. In fact, examining the data behind these tragedies might seem callous or insensitive, particularly to those who live this reality daily. However, data often provide a bird's eye view of a mass phenomenon, and looking at what the evidence shows can help inform better practices and policies on a wider social scale. In this feature, we examine the evidence behind police violence as a public health concern. I had no idea that police violence was already being examined as a public health concern. We ask, how many black men die as a result of police violence in the U.S.? Where does police violence rank as a cause of death among black men compared with other causes of death? What are some of the physical and mental health impacts that police violence has on black men in the U.S.? We turn to studies and researchers' opinions in search of answers. And they study in a study called Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Frank Edwards, that publication, Frank Edwards, PhD, an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and colleagues showed that police use of force is a leading cause of death among young black men. Edwards and team found that over the course of one's lifetime, about 1 in every 1,000 black men are likely to be killed by the police. This risk is at its highest between the ages of 20 and 35. a peak that is otherwise the same for men and women of all racial and ethnic groups. The researchers used data from an impartial, journalist-led initiative aiming to create a national database of deaths that involved interactions with the police. Edwards and team used this database for information on deaths that occurred between 2013 and 2018. And I wanted to also talk about how these studies, a lot of these studies were sparked by, cases like Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, George Floyd. And, I had talked before about what studies will be sparked by the instances of police violence in Rockford, as benchmarks that will lead academics and scholars to look deeper into these issues, because that's what has happened on a national scale. Like a lot of these scientists and researchers, they were encouraged by the uproar after George Floyd, or encouraged by seeing what happened to George Floyd, to look further into these. I thought that was interesting. Additionally, the authors used data from the 2017 National Vital Statistics System. In total, they accounted for approximately 11,456 police encounters in their analysis. The deaths the researchers accounted for in their analysis did not include deaths described by the police as a suicide, fall, overdose, or traffic accident. Their analysis looked at how age, race, and sex affected mortality risk. The study found that the highest levels of inequality and mortality risk are experienced by black men, with 1 in every 1,000 black men being likely to die at the hands of police. By comparison, the lifetime risk of being killed by police is 1 in 2,000 for all men. It's 1 in 1,000 for black men and 1 in 2,000 for all men. How police violence. Okay, so that was from an article. I'm gonna read from another article. I'll if you want to read. This was just sort of like an introduction to what they were talking about. I just wanted to share that police violence is a cause of death, a leading cause of death amongst black men. And then this article is titled "How Police Violence Affects Black Americans' Mental Health."
And then I think, and I want to let you keep on the track that you're on, and this is one of the things that I've talked to other people about, and I think that this is to sort of go back to why Antar asked earlier about the importance of police terrorism, and why we have police terrorism at where we have it at in the order of things that we're addressing. I think that for people who may not be black, who are listening to these things, if you are in any type of marginalized group or any type of exploited or oppressed group, some of these same things can be extrapolated out to you and extrapolated out to the things that you experience. And so for people who are Mexican and have to deal with ICE, or people who are maybe African immigrants and have to deal with ICE and deal with the violence that comes with ICE, for people who may be sex workers and have to deal with the violence that comes with policing and sex work, people who are impoverished and are living in communities or neighborhoods where police officers are in that community or neighborhood more often because of the poverty levels. These same type of traumas, outside of the specific statistic about how many black people die or black men die, these same type of traumas affect them. It just, again, it affects them in a different manner, in a different way. The same thing should be stated for black women and black trans folks and black folks from the LGBTQ community. And that is why the police terrorism is such an important aspect, is that the people who deal with this at a disproportionate rate historically have been black men. But you can't have this type of institutional evil happening without it trickling down and without it beginning to affect other oppressed and marginalized groups. And so I think one of the things that has not been done regularly enough with this conversation is extrapolating this out and telling people to find out how these things affect them personally and the place that they identify at personally. And if you are somebody who is poor, or have come from poverty, or come from a working class neighborhood, police terrorism disproportionately affects you. If you are again somebody who if maybe you have addiction issues or mental health issues. One of the other stats, I don't know it. I'm not going to try to remember the stat off the top of my head, but overwhelming amount of people who are killed by the police have mental health issues. And so there are all types of marginalized groups in our society where these same statistics also tell the story of their experience in the society. And so that's the only thing that I wanted to talk about.
And just to give more context and to the local news in Rockford, a lot of people are in an uproar about the uptick, I guess, in what is called, street violence, youth violence, black on black or black on brown or minority community violence is what people are in an uproar. There was a gruesome video about a shooting that's just about national news. And some people take that to say, we told you that police terrorism wasn't the real problem. Right. It's just every so often someone is killed by the police and they probably were, criminal anyway. And so you really should be focused on what they, black on black or street or so-called gang violence. And to put this in context is that the people, the youth that are expressing violent tendencies on the street, they have been disproportionately negatively affected by police violence, and that the violence begets violence. And for some of them, this is their first instance of violence. And so, like I said, the Family Peace Center is saying that, okay, a lot of the street violence is caused basically by domestic violence. And with that same idea, you can say a lot of the street violence is caused by police violence. And so since a lot of people equate street violence with African American youth, let's let you give you a little bit of where they're coming from. And you will also find in street violence, like you said, as poor whites or other marginalized communities who are associated with street violence or the youth or gang violence. And so I wanted to give a little context to say that if we want to deal with street violence effectively or youth violence or the violence that we're seeing in our community that people are thinking is a reason why protesters shouldn't even focus on police at all, where in actuality the opposite is true. And so we need to even study further the effects of police terrorism and police violence if we want to deal with the street violence that's happening in our communities. You can't deal with it without dealing with police violence. Someone did a survey on Facebook and they asked people, how old were you when you experienced your first police raid? There were people saying, I was 3, I was 4, I was 5. This was done. Before they saw that, in some cases, before they saw any domestic violence in the home, they experienced police violence. One article was talking about how the killings of George Floyd and these killings on tape, how they affect young people and how they affect people when they see them and how long it takes for people to process that. So that is also something. So this article, it's called How Police Violence Affects Black Americans' Mental Health. George Floyd's killing is a stark example of how police killings can impact the mental health outcomes in black communities. It deals with the effect in other communities as well. But this is by Sarah Ellis, and she's a health writer. This is a person in the health field. The past few weeks have brought on an avalanche of police brutality cases in the news. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Rayshard Brooks were a few of the black Americans who have died this year at the hands of white officers. Their deaths have shocked and outraged much of the nation, reigniting support for the Black Lives Matter movement and calls for justice reform. These violent events, as shocking as they are disturbingly common. Mapping Police Violence, a research and data collection group focused on collecting information about police killings nationwide. Hold on. Let me start that sentence over. Mapping police violence, a research and data collection group focused on collecting information about police killings nationwide, estimates that black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police and are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed. Quote, "We are living in a racism pandemic, which is taking a heavy psychological toll on our African American citizens," said Sandra L. Shulman, PhD, president of the American Psychological Association, in a recent statement. In fact, one study published in the Lancet found that police killings of unarmed black Americans can have an impact on black citizens lasting for at least 3 months after the incident. The paper's findings make clear that George Floyd's death and others like it have clear implications on the mental health of black Americans, further emphasizing the need for police reform and more widespread access to mental health services. Police killings and mental health. In the Lancet's report, researchers surveyed almost 40,000 black Americans and who had experienced a police killing in their state within the last 3 months. 40,000 black Americans who had experienced a police killing in their state within the last 3 months around the time of George Floyd. Researchers found that each additional police killing of an unarmed black American resulted in an increase in poor mental health days for black Americans in the state. The most significant effects occur in 1 to 3 months after the killing. They found no effects of these killings on the mental health of white Americans. No effect of police killings on unarmed white Americans on the mental health of white Americans. This is an important part. They're saying police killings of unarmed people have more effect on the mental health than police killings of armed people. In particular, even in the African American community, there's less mental health effect when the person was actually armed. Jacob Bohr, SCD, I don't know what that means, SCD, an assistant professor in global health at Boston University in Boston and one of the principal authors of this study, explains that the specific nature of these results is crucial to understanding their meaning. The specificity of the effect suggests that these police killings of unarmed black Americans wage violence against mental health of our black Americans because of the specific meaning ascribed to these events in the long history of state violence used to subjugate black Americans, he says. And I think that's why we have to be careful about calling things police terrorism that don't happen to people that have this long history, because terrorism to me is built over decades, where an encounter with the police might have an effect on like an immigrant way different, even say a poor white American that's experienced it over decades. You know, like if we just see if the police doing something to a random person is not the same as it would be to someone that has decades of that experience. In other words, there is cultural significance to police killings of unarmed black Americans connected to our country's long history of systematic racism and segregation. And see, that's why what you putting it first with the May 30th putting it first is almost as if you had did this research already. Where was that? I think I was right here. Okay. These incidents embody structural racism so clearly. That's what you said. These incidents embody structural racism so clearly. So like you said, people can see it. You know, once you see it, police terrorism, you know racial discrimination now, you know. Okay, these incidents embody structural racism so clearly because they illustrate not just that blacks are at higher risk of victimization by police than whites, but that these disparities are enforced by the power of the state and with consent of the governed. Bohr says, police killings of unarmed black Americans rarely result in charges being filed against the officer. Data from mapping police violence indicates that 99% of officers involved in killings between 2013 and 2019 were never charged. The advent of social media has pushed these deadly police confrontations to the forefront of our political dialogue, but they have been going on since our country's origin, adding to the pain felt by black Americans as these killings continue to happen in their communities. Recent research by Desmond Ang, assistant professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, notes a clear impact of police killings on the emotional health and educational success of high schoolers in the affected neighborhood. That's why activists across the country and the world have been calling for people to stop having children who have been terrorized by police violence taking pictures with police without addressing these issues seriously. You're furthering trauma, and especially when you're using this, when you believe this is a way to solve police the so-called issues with black people and the police. This research, this has to be done, and so you can understand that is not a solution to the problem. In fact, it furthers the problem. Having people take pictures with the police, having people's children take pictures with the police in school, when the police are part of the reason why they're not achieving like they should in school. You know, that's those type of things that shouldn't happen by school teachers and so-called community leaders. Shouldn't make that mistake. You know, in the days, the post George Floyd era, those mistakes have to stop. Recent research by, okay, I read that already. Okay, no, let me read it one more time. Recent research by Desmond Ang, assistant professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, notes a clear impact of police killings on the emotional health and educational success of high schoolers in the affected neighborhood. Ang estimated that each police killing in his sample caused 3 students of color to drop out of high school. 2020 Census Bureau statistics revealed that symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder spiked among black Americans in the week following George Floyd's death. Add this to the disproportionate health rate risk for COVID-19 faced by people of color, also often due to structural racism, and you have a layered network of mental health crises faced by the black community right now. So racism as a public health issue. Police brutality is more than just a political issue, says Rachel Hardiman, PhD associate professor at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health in Minneapolis, who researches the health effects of racism. Police, quote, police violence is a public health issue, end quote. She asserts, even in the absence of physical violence, several studies have shown that police stops perceived as unfair, discriminatory, or intrusive are associated with adverse mental health outcomes, including anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Hardiman's previous research has shown that people who had negative encounters with the police, even if they perceived those encounters as necessary, were less likely to trust the medical establishment. She fears how this will play out during the coronavirus pandemic. And we read an article the last time about where the former police chief of Rockford said that the 100% increase in the murder rate can be attributed to some of the decisions they made based on COVID. You know, but the racial trauma of George Floyd and the local instances of violence. You know, if someone was to do research about what we have 15 people on the poll, so you're talking about mental health trauma repeating itself when they Denzel Duvon who wanted to, Denzel, you said you had something to say to the people.
Oh yeah. Just real quick for the people, everybody outside, man. I want y'all to know justice has no color. You know what I'm saying? Make sure y'all take care of each other. Make sure y'all stand together as not a race but people, because we are not divided by ourselves. We're divided by the social media. And that's all. Y'all have a good one.
Where was I at? Okay. Okay, maybe right here. Yeah. Something about, okay. She fears how this will play out during the coronavirus pandemic. Quote, the same folks who have been terrorized by police after Mr. Floyd's murder are going to be less likely to seek help and care when they contract COVID symptoms. I don't think President Biden is taking this into account with his with some of his efforts around COVID. Hardiman notes, and those that may end up in hospitals and healthcare systems that are inherently racist, like a medical system with deep roots in economic inequality, perceived biologic differences between races, and unconscious biases from healthcare providers. In a new paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, Hardiman and her co-authors emphasized the ongoing health emergencies faced by Black Americans, heightened risk of maternal mortality, higher rates of asthma and cancer due to pollution exposure, and an increased risk of death from COVID-19. They argue that mastering the health effects of structural racism should become a primary goal of the U.S. healthcare system. One way to do this, the paper states, is by changing the existing healthcare business model. Okay, they're talking about healthcare business model. So that's pretty much, like I said, I'll put the links to these articles, but there's plenty more research out here. I asked Leslie to share in the reading some of the articles. I don't know if there's anything. I know was any of this, did any of this stand out, or was it sort of, I know you've been reading a lot in it.
No, it's I mean, all of it is, I feel like it's with these type of things that even when you go through and read something or hear something that maybe you've heard aspects of before, you always hear something new or a different element or a different perspective that you hadn't heard or considered before. So it definitely was 100% things in there that I heard that struck different thoughts and struck different beliefs, or I don't want to say struck different beliefs, but that struck different thoughts or made me think about things in different lights. And also they articulated some things that we have articulated ourselves, but in different manners. And again, I think that I think that the mental health aspect and the trauma aspect of these actions are important to link into all of this. It's not simply that one life is taken away, or one person is in prison, or one person is beat up by the police, one person is falsely arrested by the police. It's the residual effects that action has on multiple people. And I think one of the things that I think that was important that pointed out in was they pointed out how towards the end how the neighborhoods that these communities that these things happen in have you can see that there's a tangible effect in the community and the people that go to school in the community. And I think that that's one of the things that gets you back into looking at and again, the race is an important factor in all this thing, and race is a factor that can't be tied or separated from it. But when you look at it in the aspect of a killing or a police killing happening in a certain area or in a certain community, and then when you realize that I would imagine most of those communities are working class communities or impoverished communities, and so the residual effect that has on all the people that live in those communities, and the same thing, the people who are they don't go into this in here specifically. They're talking about the police terrorism and the macroaggression of someone being shot by the police. But even when you start talking about people's homes being raided in and homes being kicked in, and one of the things that I don't know what the statistics on this are, but I've had a conversation with somebody about this, how many people who their grandfathers were in jail, then their fathers were in jail, then they ended up being in jail. And so I think that one of the things that is also important to point out is that there are generational families or generations who have dealt with some of these things happening. And when you start adding in all of those elements of black people dealing with these things, of families that may have generationally dealt with these things, of communities and neighborhoods that may have dealt with these things, I think that that's when you get to the place of really understanding the the gravity of police terrorism, and so I think that was just one of the other things that pointed out to me is as they going through all of these things, just the nature and the gravity of these things. And the same thing as they brought COVID into it, an issue. I believe that with all of these things, you can add different elements into it that go to point how these things just sort of balloon and these issues sort of balloon. And so.
And I know that looked like a lot of reading. I think you might be able to get away with just probably.
So we go through and see. We figure it out. All right. So the next one, this next is titled Executive Summary. And so I'll start reading section 1 of this. This report examines the persistent situation of structural discrimination against African. The executive summary. Okay, this is the executive summary of this report. Okay, of the IACHR report. Okay, so this is the executive summary of the IACHR report, which is the Inter-American Commission's Human Rights Commission. This report examines the persistent situation of structural discrimination against African Americans in the United States and, in particular, deep-seated racial disparities in policing and the criminal justice system. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has previously considered that racial bias forms the backbone of many problems of police abuse, overrepresentation of African Americans in arrest and in prison systems, and unequal access to justice, as well as wider issues of racialized poverty and unequal access to economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights in the U.S. since the 2012 shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Since the 2012 shooting death of Trayvon Martin, a series of high-profile deaths of African Americans at the hands of police or in police custody, including Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and Terrence Crutcher, among many others, as well as public pressure from civil society groups and movements like Black Lives Matter, have made issues of racial bias in policing and the criminal justice system topics of increasing public discussion. In light of extensive information of concern received in recent years regarding the issue, the Commission undertook to write this report examining the situation. While problems of racism in policing and criminal justice are addressed as pressing civil rights issues nationally, the Commission highlights that they also raise concerns regarding the United States' international human rights obligations. Under its mandate to monitor and promote human rights in the member states of the Organization of American States, the Commission has drafted this report on the basis of information gathered from the state, civil society organizations, and victims of police violence in several public hearings held since 2014 on issues related to racism in policing and criminal justice in the U.S. During a 2015 visit to the states of Florida, Louisiana, and Missouri, through the publication of press releases, as well as information gathered via its petitions and case mechanism, and other public sources of information, including from government agencies, reports produced by United Nations mechanisms and by civil society and the media. This report evaluates the current panorama of policing and criminal justice issues in light of the historic situation of racism and discrimination in the United States, highlighting the structural nature of discrimination and the corresponding need for systematic reforms to fully address past abuses and ensure non-repetition. The Commission considers that the historical legacy of subjugation, enslavement, terror, marginalization, segregation, and exclusion from enjoying the rights of citizens in the U.S., both de jure and de facto, has continuing repercussions for African Americans' full enjoyment of human rights today in virtually every sphere. In this regard, a reckoning with the legacy of racism and discrimination in the U.S. is necessary to effectively transform the situation in the future.
Can I just say one word? So, if I heard that correctly, so anything in the sphere of human activity is affected by police, the police killings or racism within the police. So, any activities that we endeavor upon, we have to still address this issue. We can't go around. We can't go around this issue in a roundabout way. Affect this issue is what I
right. I agree with that. In this light, the Commission analyzes information received regarding issues of over-policing and racial profiling, the militarization of police forces, police use of excessive force, impunity in cases of police killings, police responses to protests, racial disparities in criminal arrests, convictions, and sentencing, and the lifelong consequences of prior incarceration and felony convictions. The Commission further considers that issues of discrimination in policing and criminal justice in the U.S. are inseparable from social stigma and hate speech, violence by private citizens, an enduring situation of racialized poverty, and intersectional discrimination, as all of these are also governed by a structural situation of discrimination and racism. These issues are reviewed in the report from a human rights perspective, considering the obligations of the United States under international law. And I think that the main thing that I'll pull away from that paragraph is just all of the aspects that go into police terrorism and why it's not simply just police brutality or just simply just police killings, but it's more nuanced than that. And there's a lot of different aspects that come together to form the concept of police terrorism. The Commission highlights that the issues of police brutality and excessive use of force, racially biased policing practices, and racial disparities that permeate virtually every part of the criminal justice system are widespread and represent a clear threat to the human rights of African Americans, including their rights to life, personal integrity, non-discrimination, and due process, among others. In this report, the Commission considers these issues in light of the United States' international obligations regarding non-discrimination, use of force, and access to justice. Throughout this report, the Commission underscores a series of key international human rights principles that apply to the situation. First, all government and police actions should be executed in accordance with the obligations of non-discrimination and the principle of equality. Second, police use of force in the United States, as in all other states of the Americas, should be guided by the principles of legality, absolute necessity, and proportionality, and used only when other methods have been exhausted and failed. Third, the protection against arbitrary deprivations of life applies to the entire state structure, including federal, state, and local government entities, and to all actions of police officers, both in situations of normality and unrest. Fourth, the government, federal, state, and local, is responsible for establishing adequate and effective legal remedies and a justice system that is independent and impartial in its investigations of police abuses and that achieves convictions when appropriate. The Commission recalls that impunity fosters an environment in which police violence and abuses are tolerated and serves to sustain disparate treatment towards groups subject to historic discrimination. Fifth, the Commission underscores the need to safeguard the basic human rights of protesters, including their rights to life and physical and psychological integrity. And I think that one of the things that, and I don't know if this paragraph specifically is points that out, but the connection that mass incarceration has to police terrorism, and how as you expand out police terrorism to its to all the things that comes underneath the umbrella, it gets you to the chain of mass incarceration as well. Regarding non-discrimination and equality, the Commission recalls that both direct and indirect racial discrimination are prohibited under international and inter-American law. In this report, it underscores as an issue of particular concern that laws or practices that have a discriminatory effect, often described as, quote, disparate impact, end quote, in domestic law, are prohibited under international law, even if they are not facially discriminatory. It is urgent that the U.S. brings its domestic law in line with international standards in order to effectively prevent and sanction cases of disparate impact. The Commission further highlights that racial profiling practices may amount to inhuman or degrading treatment under international law. In addition to the obligation to refrain from violating rights, the Commission emphasizes the state's positive obligations to adopt measures to build an inclusive society free from all forms of racial discrimination, and calls for steps to modify the culture of policing and dynamics between police and African Americans in order to build trust and confidence. And then I think one of the things that I will point out is historically there has been a disconnect and a hypocrisy in the things that America preaches overseas, or that America goes overseas in other countries to implement, and then the type of things that they allow to happen in their own country. A lot of people speak towards one of the factors that pushed the civil rights movement into the direction that they were in, into some of the progress that they were making, was that people were going over in World War I and World War II to fight overseas in this effort to preserve democracy or to push democracy further. And then those same people were coming home to America and dealing with discrimination and dealing with the hypocrisies of democracy. And the same thing can even be pointed out when it comes to the way protests and demonstrators are handled. It's a war crime to use chemical agents on the battlefield, and those same type of chemical agents are used when police officers are trying to disperse crowds and when police officers are trying to put into protest. And so that has been one of the things that historically has been true for America, that their policy in this, the way that they treat people in the country and then the things that they prognosticate outside of the country are not aligned. Regarding the use of force, the Commission reiterates in this report that the protection against arbitrary deprivations of life applies to the entire state structure, including federal, state, and local government entities, and to all actions of police officers. Therefore, police use of force must be guided by the principles of absolute necessity, proportionality, and legality. Lethal force may be permissible only when strictly necessary to protect life. The Commission calls on the United States to bring its domestic in line with international standards in this area. The Commission further highlights that excessive use of force by police may amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or torture under certain circumstances, particularly where it is committed for any reason based on arbitrary discrimination of any kind. The Commission also underscores the need to safeguard the basic human rights of protesters, as well as considerations related to the regulation of the use of lethal force and less lethal weapons in general and in protest situations. Regarding access to justice, the Commission emphasizes in this report. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking that, the basis, May 30th Alliance coming together, seeking justice for what happened on May 30th, where some of these things, some of these abuses took place. Even though the local jurisdiction turned down the request for justice, there's still hope that maybe later some international body or even a local body will look further into the abuses that happened on May 30th.
And it should be pointed out, at the same time that some of those things were happening here, there were things happening, around the country, and some other cities have put out reports on those things and condemned the actions of the officers, or said the actions of the officers should have been handled differently, particularly in New York. That was one of the things that happened. Regarding access to justice, the Commission emphasizes in this report that the government, federal, state, and local, is responsible for ensuring access to justice, including exercising due diligence to ensure independent and impartial investigation and prosecution of police abuses, and accountability and punishment for all those responsible for a violation. Establishing adequate, effective, and accessible legal remedies for police violence against African Americans, and ensuring reparations for victims. Impunity fosters an environment in which police violence, abuses, and disparate treatment towards historically marginalized groups are tolerated. The Commission is particularly concerned by the significant number of incidents of police violence against African Americans that end without convictions, including cases in which the person affected was unarmed. The Commission additionally notes that the state's duty to take measures to prevent and respond to violence on the part of the state and non-state actors explicitly or implicitly motivated by racial bias. Finally, the Commission emphasizes that due diligence in preventing police violence against African Americans must take a transformative approach. That is, actions to prevent police violence or remedies or reparations for police violence that have the effect of maintaining or reestablishing the same structural context of violence and discrimination are not acceptable. Rather, reparations must aim to address and redress the underlying situation of inequality in the ongoing context of racial discrimination. With these principles in mind, key recommendations to the United States include. You had something that you was?
No, I was just thinking about thinking about Denzel's case, and rather, I know Terry and yourself have followed the case a little more than I have, to know, is it something that the state has done to make it harder for him to have justice in his case, or reparations, not necessarily as monetary, but or have they made it where to be?
Well, as far as the civil suit, a lot of times with the type of situation that he has with being assaulted and beat in that manner, it shouldn't have no type of bearing on the civil suit. Same thing like when people get shot by the police, whether or not the police officer was found justified or they was convicted of a crime, it becomes secondary to whatever the action that the police officer took.
What about the repairing his record or reputation, or like this even goes to far as to give the person guarantee that it won't happen again?
For that, just because how the legal system set up, it's just not no possibility for that. The criminal charges, to get expunged, it'd have to be all separate from that had to all be done separate from him being assaulted and him from being beat up. As far as a civil case, I'm not sure what type of agreements can be made. I know in different situations, different laws have been passed as part of agreements for civil cases. So I think that, different things like that can be done, but I think that a lot of that probably has to do on the type of lawyer and the type of situation. But it would all be handled outside of whatever the criminal case was. And so that's some of the things that they have or that they're stating in here. Because unless there is a changing of the structure of these institutions and also an altering of the consciousness of the society, some of these things are just not possible or not probable to happen. The part of the reason that police officers, in here they're advocating for police officers to have some type of a punishment, but until you deal with how unions are set up and until you deal with how laws are set up, it becomes secondary that it's illegal on the world law to do. I don't want to say secondary, but there's things that you have. There are things that will have to be done here within the country that I think are possible to be done before we can get to a place of some of these things happening. And this is sort of a wide view of what the issue is, which is important to have this wide view of the issue, because then that helps you to be able to have smaller views of it and be able to know how you need to attack it and be able to explain to somebody just how wide-ranging the issues are. So I do agree with everything that they've pointed out in here. I just think that one of the things that they aren't advocating for is a revolution of the systems that exist in America, and I think that a lot of that probably has to be from being outside of America.
I think the commission
was it inside America?
Yeah,
okay, or maybe that's more. I guess that may be more because their ties to institutions or their ties to the idea of reformation as opposed to revolution. But some of these things, as we've seen borne out specifically in these last 12 months or so, we have to have some type of changes within the country for some of these things. But then all of those will have to happen on, as they're saying, on a local. They're talking about federal, state, and local are all levels in which these issues exist. And so that is the same way we would have to deal with them on a local level, on a state level, and on a federal level as well. So let's point out some of the things that they changes that they're speaking about. Undertake and ensure proper funding for official studies on racial discrimination in the U.S. at the federal, state, and local level, with the goal of contributing to the establishment of the full and public truth about violations, as well as forward-looking public policies to contribute to effective reparations for the victims, including satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition. Ensure that all federal, state, and local government entities fully comply with relevant domestic laws mandating the monitoring, oversight, and investigation of possible human and civil rights violations by state actors, such as police departments, as well as private individuals. Create independent ombudsperson offices at the state and local levels to receive and take action regarding complaints about discriminatory treatment. Take the necessary steps to reform domestic law, both federal and state, to bring it in line with international law as the regards of the use of force and the way of deadly force, respecting the principles of legality, absolute necessity, and proportionality. And I think one of the things I would point out here, and I don't have the greatest, I don't have the greatest understanding of all the issues that are affecting the world or the globe. But I would be remiss if I didn't take the time to point out that police terrorism is an issue that is affecting other countries and other nations. We've seen last year SARS was something that was a movement that was emerging in Africa around police terrorism. We've seen in Palestine the type of segregation that they have and the type of policing that they've used to enforce it. One of the things people point about all the time with Ferguson is that a lot of the officers who were out patrolling during Ferguson were officers who had trained with officers in Palestine. And so I do want to make sure that as they're talking about the America's laws being more in line with the global laws or with international laws, to point out internationally, police terrorism is something that is an issue as well. Mass incarceration internationally is an issue as well. There are private prisons and private security firms that operate all over the globe. Create a federal database to track incidents involving police use of force by all law enforcement agencies in a transparent, uniform, and public manner, including disaggregated data on demographics of all victims and officers involved. Ensure the prompt, thorough, independent, impartial, and effective investigation of incidents of excessive use of force and police killings, ensuring the investigation of all potentially responsible parties and, as relevant, their appropriate prosecution and punishment. Remove all de facto and legal obstacles in internal investigations, criminal proceedings, civil proceedings, and federal investigations that maintain impunity for cases of police killings, and ensure the effective and proportional punishment of police officers who commit crimes or misconduct. Take effective measures to prevent and combat the stigmatization and criminalization of protesters, in particular where such stigmatization or criminalization may be racially discriminatory in nature, and fully guarantee the right to freedom of expression. Take the necessary steps to reform domestic law, both federal and state, to bring it in line with the international law as regards the obligation to prohibit and sanction both facial discrimination and the disparate impact of facially neutral laws and policies. Take steps to reverse the effect of policies with racial disparate impacts. Yep.
Oh, okay. That's just thank you.
This is okay, and then the last part is just some thank yous. And so, like I said, I think that there were very poignant pieces throughout all of these things. It takes a very wide lens, which I think has to be balanced out with a local lens and a grassroots lens. But a lot of the things that they are pointing out are things that, in one way or another, we have been in the process of doing. You know, I think that a lot of the actions that we have done here would be fall into the line of research and study. I think one of the other things that would fall into the line of, and I say that to say that we can speak about the percentage of people who have been killed and what their race or their ethnicity was, and what the race or the ethnicity of the officers involved in it were, the areas that it happened, how often it happened. And again, we are only scratching the surface of researching and being able to articulate some of these issues. But I do believe these are some of the things that we are on the right path and on the right track for. And so it's good to see that places outside or institutions or things outside of ourselves have some of these same type of beliefs, and believe some of these same type of actions are important to getting us to a better place societal-wise. Did you have anything?
Yeah, and that's just basically it, to say that when people say F the police, or when people and I'm for abolishing the police, these things, when you do some research, you'll find out that those things aren't as strange or out of place as people sometimes think. Like that, there's absolutely no reason to be against the police. We've heard sentiments like that. And so even though some of these measures don't even go as far as we would want to go, some of them are, like you said, they're within the context of people doing a job maybe, or, compiling a report. But it goes to show you how deep of a problem it is. The gravity of police terrorism is what we want to come out of this, and for people that may be confused about how serious it is. I even think about when Black Lives Matter, people were replace it with Poets Matter, Black Healthcare Matters, or Black Colleges Matter, and these are all true. But you should never replace a saying that's talking about something that's with the gravity of police terrorism, because it sort of says that all of these things are equal. And the more research we do, the more we find how serious and urgent the police addressing police terrorism is. And just basically in closing, I wanted to share an article. It was an interview on NPR. We talked about this before. It's about the Camden, New Jersey Police Department, how it was tore apart and rebuilt. And this is very relevant to Rockford, I believe, because Camden was facing the same issues that Rockford is facing in terms of high crime rate, high violence rates. And the way that they dealt with it is almost the total opposite of the way that the current police chief or the current administration is going about it, all wrong. They're reviving old 1980s and 1990s Reagan era police tactics we're seeing used, in Rockford. And the citizens are all for it because they're traumatized and they're desperate. They're desperate for security. They're desperate to have their children to stop being shot down in the street or being fallen victims to mass incarceration. But the way to deal with that is not to over police. Call more police. There's an article that maybe in part we deal with police terrorism or part 2 or something. The article about the 15-year-old young man in Rockford that was just chased down by dogs by the police, and was called a gang member. These type of things we're seeing that instead of going forward, we're seeing a city go backwards. And so I want to read this article. It's called New Police Force. And like I said, I'm for the abolishment of the police. And of course, this is talking about some reform. But I just want to read this to show how taking away the power from the police and taking away the culture that the police currently operate with will drive down crime. And so let me share this. New police force from scratch. New Jersey City proves it's possible to reform the police. NPR's Mary Louise Kelly speaks with Scott Thompson, a former chief of police in Camden, New Jersey, about the city's efforts to build a new police force from scratch. Mary Louise Kelly hosts. In cities across the country, big and small, there are a few protest chants uniting the crowds that are demanding an end to police brutality. They include No Justice, No Peace, Say His Name, George Floyd, and this one, Defund the Police, a version of which happened in Camden, New Jersey in 2013. Camden's homicide rate was through the roof, and there were scores of excessive force complaints. So Camden's mayor and city council dissolved the city's police force and created a new one from scratch. Joining us now to talk about what that was like and what happened next is Scott Thompson, who served as police chief of police of Camden's new force from 2013 to 2019. Scott Thompson, welcome. Scott Thompson. Hi, Mary Lee. Thank you for having me. Kelly, just paint us briefly a picture of what that moment was. What was happening then that caused the mayor and the city council to say, we got to do this. The only way forward is disband the police department, start over. Yeah. Thompson, the police chief. Well, at the time, 2012 into early 2013, there was a public safety crisis in the city of Camden. Our murder rate was 18 times the national average. We were seeing crime rates that were exceeding that of a third world country. So there was a bold political initiative to essentially hit the reset button. And in 2013, every single Camden City police officer, including myself, was fired. And a good majority were hired over to the county police force. But we all had to fill out a 50-page application, retake a psychological, retake a physical, and go through an interview process. Kelly, and give me an example of, since you said you and many of the other police officers were the exiting police department, that then became the new police department, how different was it? Can you give an example of something that changed in the way the force interacted with the community? Thompson. It really started with being able to build culture as opposed to change culture. And we were able to create an organization within the identity of the officer, wherein the identity of the officer was that of a guardian and not a warrior. I was able to change the entire performance metric system within the organization that did not measure a police officer's performance by the number of arrests that they made, but rather what were the outcomes as opposed to the outputs. When I drove city streets, I wanted to see little kids riding their bicycles in front of their homes, and I wanted to see people sitting on their front steps. We changed the entire structure of the organization. We changed the entire reward system within the organization, and we put them out there on street corners and said, we don't want you to lock anybody up. We don't want you to write any tickets. We want you to be out here and talk to the people. Let them get to know you and you get to know them. Kelly, was there a downside you came up with through the traditional system of practices? Did you feel like you lost anything by getting rid of a more traditional police force, more traditional practices? Thompson, no. As a matter of fact, I experienced a maturation in my time as a police officer and as a police chief, and I was an expert practitioner in failed police policies. He admitted that these were failed police policies. And every day we used to come to work and we thought that we could reduce drug dealing and gang activity by locking up drug dealers. And we would put together teams. We would swoop in. We would do heavy enforcement. And essentially all we were doing was re-victimizing the people that live within a community, and that part inaudible, opportunities for other criminals to come in, and behind that which we were removing. We were doing everything from a proactive perspective and doing it completely unilateral from the community in and of itself. We didn't have their permission. We didn't have their consent. So we didn't have legitimacy. Kelly, I want to note that homicides in Camden have gone way down since these changes, since 2012. So have excessive force complaints. I understand. Do you attribute that to this new way of policing, and how can you know? I mean, how can you separate it out from other forces that may have been in play already? Thompson. So when you have a very low solve rate in your murders, very low solve rate, that's the case in Rockford, that essentially is an indicator of having very poor levels of communication within your community and very low levels of trust. We went from having a solve rate of 16% in 2012 to 61% in 2014. So by increasing the level of human contact with the people in the community, we were able to glean more information so that we could make the community safer for them and with them. We led the state of New Jersey in 2012 with 65 excessive force complaints. So we see a correlation between excessive force and crime and criminality and victimization of communities. Last year we had 3 excessive force complaints. So that's a 95% reduction. And we have body cameras on all of our police officers. Kelly, so what is your reaction to the calls we're hearing now? Protesters calling on cities to abolish their police forces, to not have a police department at all. These are people arguing that if you start from scratch with a new police force, like you all did in Camden, that still isn't enough because there's still all the racist systems within which that force is operating. What's your response? Thompson, so that's a bit extreme. I don't see a democratic society wherein you could completely eliminate a police force. I do think that there are some serious conversations that can happen with regards to defunding police. There are greater public safety returns on investment with programs other than putting money towards enforcement. Kelly, you mean take some funding that's currently going to a police force, aim that into other places so that the police can focus on policing? Is that the argument you're making? Well, that's exactly. I mean, look, I would have traded 10 cops for another Boys and Girls Club. But the system needs to change as far as having police respond to incidents such as mental illness. Police are not equipped. They are not trained. They're not specialized in that. But yet it continues to get delegated to them. So I think if we change the expectation of police and did not have them intersecting with community as frequently as it is and in areas where they don't have expertise, I think that the tension of some of these issues could certainly lower. So we went all the way backwards by putting police stations in the low income right across the street from what we call state housing. Or if you put the money towards having specialists handle these situations, I think cops would actually appreciate that. Kelly, so as you survey this moment in our country in which everything planned out involving questions over police and excessive force, what goes through your mind? Or let me ask it a slightly different way. What words of advice, as somebody who's been through trying to make significant changes in your force, what words of advice would you have for other people leading and overseeing police departments in America today? Thompson, how I want to see police respond is I don't want to see us circle the wagons. If you can't turn on any channel and see the public response to this, and understand that in a democratic society, police is only effective if it has the consent of the people. And to have the consent of the people, you have to be legitimate. And so that's what these pictures of with black children or going to schools on the south side or west side of Rockford and putting school children in pictures with police, and these police are using practices that show they don't have consent from the communities that they're operating in. You are sending out public relations messages saying that they do have consent from the people. You know, even if black leaders or politicians try to also push the narrative that the police have the consent. The police do not have the consent from the majority of black people or marginalized people. And these pictures promote that idea. Okay, so that's about it of the article. And like I said, I think if we really look into the gravity and how serious police terrorism is in our community, we will be able to come up with better answers and solutions to many of the most vexing problems that we have right now. So that's why, I want to take the time to flesh out police terrorism in of itself. Next, maybe we can move into mass incarceration unless there's other things in terms of police terrorism. There is one piece that I wanted to print out that I didn't get a chance to, that deals with the history of policing in African American communities and disenfranchised communities.
I had me and you had talked about the Camden, New Jersey item before. I think that what we have to do another live about the Camden again too, because I've heard some other things about it, but I don't know how to substantiate one thing from another. So I think that just in the interest of it being the most productive possible, I think that's probably a good conversation for a different time, and talking about reformation and revolution and some of the different concepts in there. So
like I said, I agree with you, and I just wanted to show the people
that's why I don't want
the connection between crime and bad policing. And that Rockford is moving in a direction dangerously. We're seeing broken windows policing. Yeah, we're seeing trumped up. The last article about the shootings, they were saying the police chief called in more police. So we're going backwards, and I think that people need to know that, especially community members and people that consider themselves social justice activists, and their thing is more policing, or people in the community that need security, feel unsafe, and believe that. Yeah, and it's not. The research shows that that's not the way.
100%. And I think, again, this did a good job of talking about the broad effects of police terrorism and how many things fall into the spectrum of police terrorism, and it also illuminates how many different entities and places around not just the country, but around the world, are doing the work of grappling with police terrorism and its intertwinedness with racial injustice and with racism and with mass incarceration as well. Did you have anything in closing?
Yeah, in closing, to the families of all the people on the memorials, you may have been denied justice now and locally, but hopefully the report, like I said, international report, people are studying it, they're looking into it still, and that is not necessarily too late for you to get justice, or for the cases to be brought back up, or for things to be you don't give up the fight, don't give up the struggle. The world is watching, as we say, and so all of the families, we want you to have resolve and have faith and be encouraged that these issues are going to be dealt with.
Yeah, 100%. That's the perfect way to put it. And then on that note, I would say rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Jovan Fresco, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Mark Barmore, rest in power to Philip Johnson, rest in power to Suzette Babler, rest in power to Faustin Guaitigo, rest in power to Little Mike Sago, rest in power to Mikey Guzman, rest in power to Joseph McCormick, and rest in power to Eddie Patterson. Please watch and share this. Like us on Facebook. We outside.